Hello, welcome. We'll probably have several people rolling in over the next couple minutes. I hope everyone's doing well today. This is Mental Health Month, and I just wanted to start today our Lunch and Learn. I have a couple of announcements, and one of those is about our Mental Health Month activities. If you're not aware, there's a wonderful art exhibit going on over at the Artist Collective until May 29th, and it's open Tuesday through Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. It's done by Bailey, who is one of our wonderful artists in town and has done several of the murals across the city, including some in our hospital. And this particular exhibit is all about mental wellness, mental illness, mental health. It's all about his journey and 6 other patients that he talked to and interviewed, and is presenting their experience. It's really, really well done. So I really hope all of you are able to go to this for at some point during this month. And I think he's going to be trying to do a travel exhibit, so hopefully it'll be at other locations over the next year. But for now, I hope everybody will enjoy going to that. I'm going to put a couple of links in the chat of resources that you will have. Not only about Mental Health Month and things from Mental Health America, but also some resources that Dr. Parker is going to share with everyone today. I just want to say before I introduce her and our wonderful speaker for today, that the presentation that she will be doing today, many of the slides are copyrighted, and we will be recording this as we usually do, and you will get the recording link, but we are not going to be giving out the slides for that reason. So just make sure that no one reproduces the slides as they are copyrighted. I just want to make sure everybody understands that. Okay, I'm so glad to introduce Dr. Jennifer Parker, who is with SAM, Spartanburg Academic Movement, and she has really incredible presentation for us. I got to see it yesterday, so I'm super excited to see the full thing. But Dr. Parker, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Yeah, thank you, Maggie. Maggie and I are neighbors, friends, colleagues. We go way back, so I'm really honored that she's my co-pilot today, and I can share this presentation with you all. So if you give me a minute, because I really have less than an hour, I am going to jump right in. I'm going to share my screen. I need to get Maggie off the screen before I can share my screen, Maggie. It's telling me you've disabled my screen sharing. So if you can, I'll wait just a moment while you manage that.
It should allow you to now.
I've got it. Great, perfect. So let me make sure we've got sound, we've got PowerPoint, and there we go. All right. So what I'm going to try to cover in the next about 50 minutes, I hope. I've cut this presentation down from 4 hours to 3 to 2 to 1, and it's a topic I'm very passionate about. So it's something I like to talk a lot about. If those of you on this webinar today have interest in continuing the discussion, I want you to reach out. And if you'd like more extended training, this is what we're doing at Spartanburg Academic Movement. So I'd love to talk with you about a more extended training. But today's an introduction. It's an introduction to building a trauma-informed community. And when we think about a trauma-informed community, it comes with a framework of understanding ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences, and the impact of adverse childhood experiences potentially on our lifelong health and well-being. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, about the types of stress that are created from this adversity and the potential impact in a harmful way that it can have, not just on a child's development, but on development across the life course, unless we think very strategically about how we respond to this adversity. So we're going to spend the last part of this discussion talking about our responses in building resilience so that we don't see these negative outcomes. And then just a couple of minutes discussion around what a trauma-informed community approach might look like, because that's what we are really aiming for in our work at Spartanburg Academic Movement. So again, it's an honor to be here with you today, and I will try to advance my slides. Okay, so I would like for you to think for just a moment about your own childhood. This is a presentation that has some personal aspect to it. We're going to do some personal reflection, although we're not going to do any personal sharing. This is, as I said, because it's personal, we want to keep an anonymous aspect to what we're experiencing or feeling today. But I want you to be aware of how you're feeling about your own childhood experience and monitor how you're feeling. So think about your childhood. Think about what might be that first childhood memory that you have. And that, if you feel safe doing so, I would love to have a chat briefly of a few early childhood memories. And Maggie is going to handle that chat. I can't see the chat. I can't see you, so I'm just talking to my computer screen. But I'd love for you to share out anything you feel safe doing about your own childhood memory. And Maggie, if you'll just read a few of those in the
I'll be glad
discussion.
to. Yeah. Visiting shut-ins as a toddler with
Maggie,
my father.
I cannot hear.
Uh-oh.
Okay, hold on. My Bluetooth is.
Can you hear me?
I can now.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. We have visiting shut-ins as a toddler with my father.
Okay.
I know one of my first memories is standing at the front door of my grandparents' house, greeting my great-grandfather because he was coming to visit us. And I remember looking up from down below and seeing him.
Wow. Anything else?
I don't see anything else in the chat yet. Do we have any other memories? Oh, got one. Earliest childhood memory at 3, being weaned from breastfeeding as my younger sister was to be born. So
that can be traumatic.
yes.
Thinking about our early childhood memories, typically what I hear is around the age of 3. And they're often things like birth of a younger sibling or a visit to a grandparent's house. I think the visit to the shut-ins is really sweet. And
There's another
obviously,
one here too. I'm being stung by a bee on the back
ah,
porch.
wow. So
And
that's memorable. And hopefully you had a really positive response from family to help take care of that that
exactly.
trauma.
Then someone lost their red balloon in the sky, balloon they had been given.
Well, these are typical memories that we hear when we're trying to recall our very early memories. We seldom remember things before the age of 3. Occasionally I'll hear the age of 2, but we can recall things around the age of 2 to 3 because our brains have wired in these pathways where we can actually store those memories and be able to retrieve them and put words to the memories. But no one ever says, I remember being 3 months old or 6 months old, or I remember being in the crib in the room next door. And I could hear my mother screaming as my stepfather was punching her. But those infants that are in the crib in the room next door are storing those memories, those experiences, even though they cannot tell us about the experiences. All of our experiences from the time we're born are present, even if they're not recalled in a cognitive way. They're stored in our bodies. And some of these memories, when they're traumatic, high stress memories, we can store them in our bodies and they can create a tremendous amount of harm if we're not able to address and work through those stressful experiences. So I want you to keep in mind that what children experience makes a difference, and even before they can tell us about their experiences. In fact, there's some new research that tells us what happens the first couple of months of life um, has a very profound impact on wiring the child's brain in a way that determines how they view the world and some of their emotional well being. So it's critical to have healthy, safe environments from the very beginning. So we're going to talk about ACEs, and ACEs are adverse childhood experiences in childhood. Some of you may be familiar. I can't see who's in the room, so I don't know if you are familiar with the ACE study. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the ACE study, but when I say ACEs, I'm talking about adversity in childhood, and I'm talking about a very large study that assessed 10 categories of adversity, um, and then assessed it with a very large group and determined the impact across the life course of these adverse experiences. So there were 10 ACEs in the original study, 5 around household dysfunction, 3 around abuse, and 2 neglect. And these 10 ACEs were determined to have a potentially harmful impact on a child's development by the Centers for Disease Control at the time of the study. We know they do, they still do. We know there are more ACEs. We're just going to talk about these 10 in this short presentation today. But I want to issue a trigger warning because we're going to read through the questions. And as I'm not going to read them to you, I'm going to ask you to read them. And as you read these questions, it can trigger some of your own experiences from childhood. Be aware of how you're feeling. Be aware if it triggers personal distress. We'll provide some resources. Maggie's going to put some resources in the chat if you feel like you need resources following this presentation. And also, if it causes distress, please reach out to Maggie or myself via email or however you would like to get in touch. But let's look at the ACE questions and talk about what these researchers found in this study. So they asked 17,000 participants prior to your 18th birthday, did you experience, and they have 10 questions. I've got 4 on this screen and 6 on the next screen. And I would like for you to read through each question. The participants were asked to say either yes or no. It's a yes or no question. And if they said yes, they received a score of 1 for each of these categories of adversity. Didn't matter how many times or how severe, just did you experience this or not? Yes or no? So I'll give you a moment to read through the first 4 questions. Again, these are difficult to read, so be aware of how you're feeling in this space today. So again, scoring a 1 for each question, the total yeses would be an individual's ACE score. So everyone has an ACE score. It can be 0, it can be 10. Um, and what they did with this ACE score is what I'm going to share with you in this presentation. So Doctors Anda and Filiti are the principal investigators of the study. It's not a new study. The study was conducted probably the late 80s. The first paper was published in the early 90s. Since then, there are hundreds of papers published. This has been replicated, although it began with 17,000 participants. That's a sizable population health size study. It's been replicated with over 400,000 people. So we know what they found and reported with the adversity in childhood has some really strong science behind it. We can make some very valid connections and predictions in the population based on our childhood experiences. So this was based on asking participants up to age 18, those 10 categories of adversity. Again, 17,000, they were mostly Caucasian, all had health insurance because they were participants in a very large health consortium, the Kaiser Permanente Health Consortium. And Dr. Filiti was an internist at the time at this, the Kaiser Permanente in San Diego. Dr. Anda was at the Centers for Disease Control. And both were curious about why some of their patients did not have traditional risk factors, yet they were experiencing some serious health issues. And they were resistant to some of the interventions and treatment. Dr. Filiti had a very successful weight loss clinic. So actually it was studying obesity that led to this finding of childhood experiences. And in his weight loss clinic, people were referred to him that were classified as morbidly obese. Their obesity was dramatically affecting their health and well-being. And he had a successful program to help them reach a healthier weight. And he found a sizable group would reach that successful goal of losing the weight, falling in that healthier range, yet they would drop out of this program. And as he followed up with these individuals who dropped out of the program, what he found was they had put on even more weight, even faster than they had lost the weight. So he was curious and he began to ask questions, to follow up, to do interviews. And what he found were the individuals who were not successful sustaining the weight loss were women, and they were women who had experienced childhood sexual abuse. So he found a single common denominator across this group, and most of them had never told anyone, never disclosed. So they had adapted to that traumatic childhood experience in ways that were very unhealthy. Their coping mechanism with their attitudes around food, the way their bodies processed and stored fat, all of these things put them at higher risk for obesity. And when they lost the weight, that was their primary way of coping with the trauma and the stress. So they didn't have the adequate skills to be able to maintain. So they put the weight back on. Dr. Anda found some similar findings in some of the work he was doing at the time with those who were smoking and in a tobacco cessation program. So they put this study together. It was so extraordinary what they found. The medical community said, we reject this. It can't be that strong a connection between our childhood experiences and our adult health. So they redid all of the statistics, all of the analysis, found it was quite valid, and it kind of sat for a while because no one really knew what to do with these findings. But then they began to talk about it, teach about it. The medical community began to think about ways they could talk to patients about their childhood. And now it has become a very public health framework for how we think about health and well-being. And we can't ignore thinking about an individual's childhood and what they experienced and how they worked through that. So for me as a psychologist, that's interesting to ask a lot of adults questions and make all these fancy statistical analysis and make population health predictions. That's important because when we can predict things, we can prevent things. So I think that's critical for us to use this framework. But it's also important for us to think about how it happens and think about how it happens in ways that we can respond more effectively to children, to youth, and even to adults and prevent some of these poor outcomes that we'll talk about. So I'm not going to get into the neuroscience. That's actually the most fascinating part to me, but I do want you to think about the neuroscience behind this because it's how the stress from the ACEs affects the development of the nervous system, the architecture of the brain that puts us on this pathway to poor outcomes when we don't intervene and stop it. So the nervous system, that system that orchestrates, our body systems in such an extraordinary and remarkable way, also helps us perceive events that are happening around us and make sense of all of the sensory information that we're receiving. And when we experience a great deal of stress, a great deal of trauma, our brains become wired differently, and our perceptions of how we're safe in our environment are shaped and influenced. So think about that infant in the crib, hearing mom screaming in the room next door. That infant's nervous system is responding and developing differently from that infant who's developing in a very safe, nurturing environment. Um, so I love to teach the neuroscience to students. I'm just going to put this graph up to show you the difference between some periods in childhood of what neurons look like. All of you are well versed in the brain science and brain development, but from birth to elementary age, I just want you to look at this graphic and note the difference. There's not a lot of difference in the neurons. We're born with most of our neurons. Last count I think they reported was around 86 billion. But between birth and elementary age, something very remarkable happens. And it's the most extraordinary period of brain development because all of these neurons, these some very immature seedling cells, these unconnected cells begin to branch out and form very complex circuits and connections. And they do this for the purpose of advancing our development and helping us be able to handle more complex learning and aspects of development, but it's based on experience. So what happens in childhood, what a child experiences is going to determine what type of connections are going to form and be robust and lasting into puberty. So again, experience is driving neurodevelopment. And a child growing up in that high ACE environment on this top pathway is waking up every day, experiencing a lot of trauma. So go back to the questions that you read in that questionnaire around ACEs and think about this child on the top pathway that's growing up in a home that maybe has 3, 4, 5 ACEs. And imagine what it's like every day in their environment. This child is experiencing a lot of chaos. If you work in the mental health field, you're well versed on the percentages of individuals that have mental health problems, that have substance abuse problems. You're well versed if you work in the nonprofit world on the domestic violence that our families are experiencing. We have high rates of these ACEs in our community. And the children that are growing up in these homes that are experiencing these ACEs, these high stress homes, high ACE homes, are wiring in a different part of their brain than our child on this bottom pathway that's growing up in the nurturing, safe environment. So they're building a brain that's based on surviving, because as humans, that's what we're born to do, is survive. And for this child on the top pathway, his environment is very unsafe, it's very chaotic, it's very stressful, and he's constantly needing to activate the fight, flight, or freeze part of the brain to feel safe. We all know what that feels like. We all know how our body's flooded with neurochemicals to help us have better surveillance of where the threat's coming from, the adrenaline that helps us better fight or flee, the stress hormones that are released in our bodies, the cortisol in particular, to help support all of that rapid organ function. So this this child is constantly being flooded with these neurochemicals and building a very robust fight, flight, or freeze response that's going to carry into adulthood if we don't help them manage that. Our child on the safe pathway, they're going to do well when they start school or have a better opportunity to do well, because they're going to feel safe, nurtured. They're going to interact better with others. They're going to have better people skills. Um, Brain's going to be wired differently for processing. So we're seeing two patterns of development that can be very, very difficult when we don't intervene. So stress is the mechanism. And I just want you to think about three different types of, it's not types of stress, it's how we respond to stress, and particularly how we respond to stress in childhood. It's creating this difference in how the brain is being formed. So not all stress is harmful. We know that, and this is literature from Jack Shonkoff. He's at the Harvard Center for Developing Child, and he first started publishing about the impact of stress on child development. And positive stress helps a child develop well. It helps promote resilience. It helps them develop those coping skills. So we don't want to remove all stress from children, then they're just going to grow up in a bubble and not know how to function as adults in the world. But positive stress doesn't activate the stress response system in a prolonged way. And it actually promotes good problem solving. It provides them opportunities to feel successful and learn some essential skills. So a child that's experiencing the positive stress is developing self-regulatory skills, self-management, what we call social emotional skills, that are setting them up for better success in school and in life. Children can endure serious stressors when it's a short-lived stressor, and it can be remedied. So it's not going to cause this toxic stress on neurodevelopment when we intervene and help remedy the stress and calm that stress response system down. What's harmful to children is the toxic stress, the ACEs, that's extreme, that's long lasting, and they don't have supportive relationships to buffer that effect. So those are the ACEs we're going to talk about, and that's what I'll show you puts children on this potentially lifelong pathway to harm when we don't have the right responses in place. So it's about how we adapt from the time we're born, actually even prenatally, but how we adapt to the environments that we're born into. And it's about our biology. And when our biology based on ACEs, based on toxic stress, collides with social expectations, this is when we start to see a lot of difficulty and we run into trouble. So we know that ACEs, that child maltreatment affects neurodevelopment. We can't predict if you have 10 ACEs, we're going to see these structural functional changes in your brain. But we know that types of maltreatment, gender, age, duration, even the child's own individual differences do affect how the brain is developing. And in particular, we see changes in several structures, and there's a lot of neuroscience now to support this this research from ACEs, and If you're interested in the neuroscience, I find that fascinating. The Harvard Center for Developing Child is doing a lot of this research and finding and imaging brains of children with a lot of ACEs. There are changes in the limbic system, and the two structures in particular, the amygdala and the hippocampus, um, in the limbic system are functionally, structurally different for many children with a lot of stress, which the amygdala is often enlarged, overreactive. That's that fight, flight, or freeze part of the brain. So even if they're not in a crisis, even if they're not experiencing a threat, their brain may interpret something relatively normal as a threat um, based on that low threshold and that amygdala response. The hippocampus for many children has been imaged as smaller, and that affects how they interact with others. It's vital for social cues, for memories. Just imagine if you're not very good at reading social cues. We do that all the time in our interpersonal relationships, and that helps us be better communicators and interpersonally get along better. But if you're not reading people well, you're going to misinterpret their cues. You're going to interpret things as more harmful. And that's a kid who may bump into someone in the lunchroom and perceive it as a threat and automatically get into a fight versus perceiving it as just an accidental, oh, excuse me, I didn't mean to bump into you. So they start to interpret their world as unsafe and threatening because that's the environment that they've been born into. This is a part of the brain. There's some new research in the back of the brain, the cerebellar vermis that connects the two hemispheres. And if you're interested in this research, it's imaged as smaller with less blood flow in individuals that have had a lot of adversity in childhood. Um, that's related to adult addiction, mental illness, attention problems. Um, that's a part of the brain that helps regulate neurochemicals that make us feel good. So just imagine if you've got less blood flow, a smaller, less functional part of the brain that's helping to regulate things like dopamine, serotonin, you just don't feel as good. And you're set up for self-medicating and put on this pathway to mental health, poor mental health outcomes. Corpus callosum in this research is especially profound for boys who have experienced child neglect, which is the largest percentage of what our children are experiencing in Spartanburg. As far as child abuse and neglect, by far the largest percentage are experiencing neglect. For boys growing up with a lot of child neglect, they have a less density in this part of the brain, the corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres. So they're not processing as well. They're not shifting between the two hemispheres as well, which then creates problems for learning, problems for emotional regulation. Um, so structurally, functionally, stress is creating a very different brain for our children and sending them into adulthood with a lot of on a pathway for potentially a lot of difficulty, a lot of health difficulty, a lot of mental health difficulty. So stress is how the children and youth begin to interpret stress. That threshold is changed, and that set point is in place really in early adulthood. So this could be the individual who you accidentally cut them off on the highway and they think, wow, you did that on purpose and you're going to see road rage. So that's an extreme example, but it's the interpretation of stress, and it differs based on how our brain becomes wired from those early experiences. Um, it also changes our genetic expression. So ACEs has an intergenerational component. And if you're interested in the epigenetics behind this, it changes how genes are transcribed and read So future generations are at higher risk of repeating this cycle. It also changes our chromosomes, the tips of our chromosomes, the telomeres that program cells for longevity, for how long that cell is going to reproduce, are shorter. So there's going to be less cellular turnover for some of these genes, and we're going to see a shorter lifespan. So we're on a more rapid aging cycle based on the stress of ACEs. So that's a pretty dire presentation on what ACEs can do from childhood and how it affects us neurologically and how it affects our health and well-being. But it's all preventable, and that's why I'm so glad you all are on this webinar today. The good news is we can do something about it. We have a choice, and we have an obligation to think about our environments in a different way, to think about our responses to some of these behaviors that we see, and do some things differently, change our responses so that we can help change this trajectory. So the impact can be very dire and lifelong, or it can be very, or we can remediate it, intervene, and put people on a path of hope and well-being. So we have a lot of potential to do something to change these outcomes. So the ACE study, those 10 categories of adversity, and we know there are more. I'll show you a graph that has been studying more, but for the purpose of this short presentation today, those 10 ACEs can potentially disrupt neurodevelopment. And there's a great deal of research to show structural functional changes based on the types of adverse experiences. And that leads to social problems in childhood, emotional dysregulation, cognitive impairment, and these difficulties with learning, with behavior, with getting along with others, and that then early adoption of health risk behaviors. So think about your 10, 11, 12-year-olds having risky sex. They're not just they're not just kids that are experimenting. These are kids that have been put on a pathway to harm. And many of our teen mothers, in fact, there's a huge correlation between our teen mothers and child abuse and neglect. So they're put on this pathway early to health risk behaviors based on these changes in the brain and difficulty regulating emotions, self-medicating, making healthy decisions. And that leads to the adult problems of disease, disability, social issues, and early death. So one of the most shocking statistics from this study is the individuals that answered yes to 6 or more of those questions in this study died 20 years earlier. So that shows the impact of stress on the body in really shortening our lifespan when we don't intervene and do something to help them stop this progression. So we can intervene at any place on this pyramid. I like to think about intervening very early in childhood, and we do that by helping, not always removing all of the stress, all of the ACEs from a child's life. Optimally, we want to do that. But we can teach children how to manage the stress in their lives. And when they can begin to perceive stress as something manageable, something they have supportive resources for, then they can start to utilize tools to help them calm that system down, and we can prevent that disrupted neurodevelopment, or we can help repair. We know from neuroscience that stress can really impact the brain in a negative way, but we also know that positive experiences can impact the brain in a very healthy, positive way and repair and restore some of those disrupted connections in the brain. So what we found is ACEs are very common in the population. I had planned to do a poll, but I really don't have time to do it today. But normally when I present ACEs to a group, I like to safely and anonymously do a poll of the ACEs in the room. And what I have found, and I've found this with thousands of individuals, is it's no different from the original study. We see they're common, they co-occur, and we see this same distribution where more than 2/3 typically have an ACE score of at least 1. And in this original study, 16% had 4+ ACEs. I see a higher, typically a higher percentage in the groups that I teach ACEs to, and that's healthcare providers, social workers, teachers, um, highly educated professionals. So ACEs are common in our population now, and you can go to the Children's Trust website, and they actually have ACEs data for the Spartanburg County, and you can see how high ACEs are right now in Spartanburg County. So what does that mean for us? I think it's important for us to just take a minute. Again, if we had polled the room, we would see probably that 2/3 of the people, even on this presentation, have an ACE score of more than 1. But it's important to think about that because we're not the statistics that I'm talking about. Those of us who have an ACE score beyond 0 have had opportunities to remediate those ACEs, to build essential resilience, to get off of that negative trajectory and go on to healthy development and healthy well-being. That's what we want for everyone. When we think about that, what's the difference between, let's just assume for a minute that I have an ACE score of 10 and I have a PhD and I have a job and I can support my family, and for the most part I can regulate my emotions, not all of the time, but most of the time. So I'm doing okay. I'm not those statistics because I've had opportunities along the way. So this is hypothetical, but that's the case for all of us who are doing well. So it's important to understand when we think about ACEs, it is not diagnostic of all individuals, but it is predictive of the population. And it is a useful tool. It's not a useful tool to go and assess ACE scores of children in a classroom. It may be a useful tool in the mental health world, in the hospital, clinical world, but it's important for us to use it as a framework so that we can understand the impact that it has and how we can respond differently and prevent so much of the impact of ACEs. So it's also important for us to understand, so those of you who are participating today that maybe have an ACE score of 0, let's say I have an ACE score of 0. I'm not going to understand when I see someone that's struggling with life, that's struggling to have a job. I may have a harder time with insight and empathy around what helped that individual get to the place they are. And I may make some wrong assumptions. So when we understand the impact of ACEs and how strongly that relates to a lot of these really complex health issues, complex behavioral health issues, it gives us more insight, more connection, and then we can be more successful in how to respond um, with compassion and how to intervene. So I think it's important that we all understand our own ACE score. But if you have an ACE score beyond 0 and you're doing well, these statistics do not apply to you. But this is the study with the 17,000 that shows the percentage of individuals with health problems. These are chronic health problems based on their ACE score. And look at that perfect linear relationship, that dose response relationship. So what this slide tells us, the higher your doses of different types of ACEs, the higher percentage of people in the population will have health problems. So it's really more about how many different types of ACEs you have that they found had the most harmful effect. And that makes sense as you think about the neurodevelopmental part of this. The brain is developing in um, different time periods, different parts of the brain are developing at different critical periods. So different types of experiences can affect different structures and different times when the brain's developing. So putting us on a um, more harmful pathway. This shows the impact of early smoking, the progression to current smoking, and then chronic pulmonary disease. Again, a linear relationship between our ACE score and early smoking and current smoking and chronic pulmonary disease. This one is one of, I think, the most disturbing connections between depression and childhood adversity. So think about those low levels of neurochemicals, and 60% of the women in the study with 4 or more ACEs. I'll go back to that graph that I put up. That was 16% of those, 17,000. And 60% reported, 60% of the women reported experiencing major depression. So it affects our mental well-being, what happens in childhood. And suicide attempts, there's a 20-fold uptick from 0 ACEs to 4 or more ACEs in attempts of suicide. And just look for a minute at the column of health and social problems. So as we know, ACEs co-occur, and as they co-occur, the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to have multiple health and social problems. So think about having 7 or 8 of these health and social problems, and you're not doing life very well. These are the people you see in the ER, the people that you see with chronic mental health difficulty. They're not keeping a job, they may be incarcerated, homeless, they're not parenting well. You can't be doing life well when you have multiple health and social problems that are listed in this column. So ACEs can predict a lot of poor outcomes. These are some of the other ACE attributable problems. I'm going to skip through a few of these, but it's about how we adapt. And we can adapt in ways that put us on a very risky pathway that's going to likely result in chronic health problems, disability, behavioral health, low wage jobs if you get a job at all, unless we work to do something differently. This is just one study on expanding ACEs. When you add more ACEs that they're now studying, like bullying, community violence, neighborhood safety, you can see it goes up to 83.2% of this study reporting at least one of these experiences. So we've got a lot of work to do around our communities as well. So the goal of understanding trauma and ACEs and how it affects us across the life course is to help us think about the strategies to build resilience, which is that capacity to be able to cope with the adversity. When you're overwhelmed with this stress in childhood, you begin to view it as something unmanageable, overwhelming, something you can't cope with. You become hopeless, and we see that a lot in our adult population as well. When we can start to provide tools to build resilience, stress can become more manageable. Children can begin to see setbacks as things that help them grow, and we can teach these skills. It's really exciting to see how our schools and all of Spartanburg schools now are learning the trauma framework and implementing strategies to build resilience. Historically, we haven't done a very good job in our systems. Our schools, for example, have suspended a lot of children that had trouble managing stress. That just continues to create more stress when when a child's not behaving in school because of what happened at home the night before, and we send them back home and they miss all of our nurturing, supportive environment and opportunities to learn, then we expect them to come back and be better, but we've actually made them worse. So that's a system change that we're seeing a lot of changes that are helping build resilience for children, because resilience we're not born with.
Jennifer, it's Maggie. I
Yeah,
just wanted to point out the time. So I know you wanted to have a little bit of time for questions too. So
okay. I'm going to run through this then and wrap up for some questions. But the point I want to make about resilience is we're not born with it, it's learned. And children and youth in high stress environments didn't have the opportunity to learn it. So we have an obligation and responsibility to help them develop that resilience. And then we can prevent all of these negative things I just showed you. So, this is a great picture to think about a kid coming to school and we wanted to just do well in math, but look at all of the things they're bringing with them into the classroom. When we can just understand that the stress can have such a harmful effect on them and give them tools to manage it, we can prevent so much. So many, about greater than half actually, of lifetime adult mental disorders began in childhood, 75% before the age of 25. So this is preventable when we create nurturing, supportive environments. Um, so I've got about 2 more minutes and then I'm going to call for the question. I'm going to skip my video and make just a couple of points that resilience trumps ACEs. If you don't take anything else away from this, I want you to understand that we can't take away a child's adverse experiences, but when we promote a lot of positive experiences, when we give them tools to be able to manage stress, help them develop their social emotional skills, we can counter that impact and buffer the effect. So there's plenty of research in positive childhood experiences. That part we can do a lot of work in boosting those supportive relationships, the stable, protective environments, and give them opportunities to engage and connect and develop those social emotional competencies that they weren't able to develop in their toxic environments. Then they can manage their lives. So it's really a shift in our mindset. It's not what's wrong with these children, it's what's happened to them. It's how can we get away from deficit training to asset training and building relationships because they're essential and putting trauma sensitive responses in place. So, characteristics of programs that foster resilience, all the staff are trauma informed. Now, today you didn't really get enough to say you're trauma informed, but your trauma you've had some knowledge about trauma and ACEs, and hopefully you're curious about trauma sensitive practices. That would be important to resist re-traumatization. You don't have to know an individual's ACE score to be able to respond and help them develop those skills they need. So it's consistent positive responses across all community agencies, organizations, in reducing ACEs and developing more effective responses. And it's not just about the ACE score, it's a lot of other factors that what we call expanded ACEs. At SAM, we're using a 2-generational approach, and this is our theory of change. We want to put children on a pathway from cradle to career to success so that they can have economic success, social emotional success. But we've got to address some of these impediments. You can see violence, ACEs, addiction, criminal justice involvement, and we've got to address some of the built environment issues. So I'm very excited that we're launching a, a 2-generational approach that's going to have some real impact, I think, in the community. And I'd love to talk with some of you more about that. But it's 5 minutes till. I've run through my presentation. I hope a little bit of it made sense. And I'd love to answer any questions that you might have for the remaining 5 minutes. And Maggie's putting some a resource page in the chat that has a list to some of the links of more information about these topics, as well as some resources from the United Way if anyone would um, like more information and resources.
We're getting questions about you doing the more extensive ACEs training, and I did put your email address in the chat. I'm assuming that's the way people should contact you about that, or?
Contact me via email. I'm doing a great deal of training and it's part of our mission at SAM. So I'm happy to do some extended training around um, ACEs, around resilience, building trauma-informed communities. I can do an hour's hard for me, as you can tell, but I can tailor it to meet your needs and to the population that we're working with. So please email and let me know, and I'm happy to um, provide that. Other questions? I want to make sure everyone's okay. If you're not feeling okay after this question, you have concerns, you feel distress, reach out to Maggie or reach out to me or one of the contacts through the United Way resource.
We do have a question. If a child is in a nurturing home but a stressful school environment, what are their chances of developing serious mental health issues over time?
Yeah. Okay, so again, this is more population health. So I'm going to say their chances, you don't want them to be in a high stress environment where they're not successful. But if they have nurture and support, I want you to go back to Jack Shonkoff's research. That's considered tolerable stress if you can mediate the problem. So if you can address the stressor and provide support for the child, it's not about eliminating stress. It's helping children see stress as manageable, giving them the tools to cope. So as a parent, we don't want to run in and solve all their problems, but we want them to feel capable of managing the issues they're dealing with.
Here's
Not knowing the stressor, that's about the best I can do.
Yeah, right. Here's one more question. Thank you, Dr. Parker. I work for Miracle Hill with homeless in Spartanburg. In most cases, I see folks for only a few weeks and then they are gone and will return at a later date. What are short-term exercises that I can use to help people overcome ACEs?
And that's really huge. Thank you for that question. Don't ever underestimate just intentional kindness, support. There's so many cases where someone will say, you know, it was just that one counselor, that one teacher, that one person that believed in me. Be kind, be compassionate, provide hope, but also teach them short-term skills to regulate their emotions. In other words, when you're distressed, don't react, stop. Here's some mindfulness, here's some breathing techniques. There's a lot of quick interventions you can do. So if you can implement that at Miracle Hill, I'd be glad to do some training with you. You know, those are soft skills they can take with them, and that would be beneficial in helping them make that connection.
Thank you so much, Dr. Parker. I just want to say to everyone, please check the chat for the information about how to reach her, and also the resources list that she gave. It's actually in a PDF file, and I put the link in the chat. Do look for your post lunch and learn email that you will get likely tomorrow. We'll have the video recording in that. It will also have all the information about getting your CEUs if that's something that you're interested in. And then I'm going to also post in the chat right now a Zoom registration link for our July Lunch and Learn, as well as we are launching today a resources section on our website, mhaspartanburg.org, which will also have videos of all of our Lunch and Learns. So thank you all for joining us.
Thank you. I
Thank you, Dr.
appreciate your
Parker.
attendance today. Thank you all.